podcast of Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. On this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, we hear from Alan Packwood, author of How Churchill Waged War, an introduction to Winston as war leader. Packwood, the head of the Churchill Archives Center, explores issues that are lesser known than Churchill's famous oratory, such as how he organized for success in dealing with the unique challenges that confronted him as he assumed the premiership, how he dealt with questions of civil-military relations by assuming the role of defense minister, which had not previously existed. It also takes a look at questions of fighting with allies, and how these very features that made Churchill such an indomitable war leader led ultimately to his transition from power after the war. Let's listen in.
Few figures are better known or more instantly recognisable than Winston Churchill. He is the scowling, bow-tied bulldog warrior with the V for victory salute and the omnipresent cigar, who turned the British wartime establishment on its head and whose oratory gave the lion's roar that imbued the British people with the will to fight. That is Churchill, the icon. And that's the Churchill that is today celebrated, of course, on the British £5 note, where you can see the hands of Big Ben in the background are permanently frozen at 3 p.m, commemorating the moment that he finished delivering his blood, toil, tears and sweat speech, his first parliamentary address as Prime Minister, in which he famously promised victory at all costs, victory in spite of all terror, victory however long and hard the road may be. Yet behind the icon was a man, and behind that rhetoric, a question. How? How could Churchill seek to deliver this promised victory? His 6-minute speech to Parliament on the 13th of May 1940 was an oratorical masterpiece, but it contained absolutely no details of strategy or policy. So what were the key decisions and how were they taken? I wanted to write an archivist's book, and this was referred to in the introduction, to strip away the layers of hindsight and to look at Churchill's leadership in the moment. Because it's perhaps a self-evident thing to say, but while waging war, Churchill and his contemporaries did not know how it was going to turn out. It's an approach that I think is perhaps best illustrated by a quote from a memoir by John Martin, a civil servant who joined Churchill's inner team as private secretary in the spring of 1940. And when reflecting on those momentous days, Martin was prepared to admit that with the luxury of hindsight, they may have formed the finest hour. But that was not how they'd seemed at the time. Then, he wrote, they had been a time of agony piled on agony. And this, I think, brings me to my first main point and the first chapter in my book, which is that we need to remember that Churchill was often waging war from a position not of strength, but of weakness. Now, while it's true that he later wrote about his assumption of the premiership in May 1940, that he felt as if I were walking with destiny and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial, it's easy for us here to forget that there were many in the British establishment and among the political elite who didn't share his confidence. From the outbreak of war, Churchill had been back in Neville Chamberlain's War Cabinet as First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian minister in charge of the British Navy. But he was felt by many to be an opportunist and a maverick. He'd first entered the British cabinet in 1908 at the age of just 33, and over the course of the next 20 years, he'd served in many of the major offices of the British state. But it had been a roller coaster ride. And in the decade leading up to the outbreak of war, he'd been excluded from high office. To some of his political contemporaries, he was a reactionary figure who told the suffragettes he wouldn't be henpecked, prompting this attack by suffragette Theresa Garnett on him on Bristol Mead's railway station with a dog whip. He championed the costly Gallipoli campaign in World War I. He dismissed Gandhi as a half-naked fakir. Some had even dismissed his calls for rearmament in the face of Hitler's growing power as a cynical ploy designed to undermine Prime Ministers Baldwin and Chamberlain, though, of course, that campaign had gained him the support of large sections of the press and public, particularly after Munich, building up the pressure so that Neville Chamberlain had no choice but to bring him back into the cabinet. But his long and controversial career, with its changes of party, had made him enemies on both sides of the House of Commons. He'd started as a Conservative in 1900, defected to the Liberals in 1904, and then back to the Conservatives in 1924, famously allowing him to remark that anyone can rat, but it takes a certain ingenuity to re-rat. Now, such fears, suspicions, rivalries and jealousies were only exacerbated by Churchill's forceful personality, a combustible mix of eloquence, self-confidence and energy with a tendency to dominate that didn't always make him a congenial colleague. This, after all, is the man who told his friend Violet Bonham Carter at an Edwardian dinner party, "My dear, we are all worms, but I do believe that I am a glowworm." When you get to 1940, the wonderfully named General Sir Edmund Ironside, Chief of the British Imperial General Staff, observed in his diary that Churchill's physique must be marvellous, but I cannot think that he would make a good Prime Minister. He has not got the stability necessary for guiding the others. Jock Colville, a private secretary in Downing Street for Neville Chamberlain initially, who would later become a great friend and confidant of Churchill, was initially equally damning, writing that Churchill's verbosity and restlessness make a great deal of unnecessary work, prevent any real practical planning from being done, and generally cause friction. And that wasn't an isolated view. Leo Kennedy, diplomatic editor of The Times, in his diary entry for the 4th of May, 1940, wrote, "There is a drive against Chamberlain. I can't quite see who can advantageously take his place. Curiously enough, what is really needed is that Winston should be made to take a rest. He's overdoing himself and taking the strain by stoking himself unduly with champagne, liquors, etc. Dines out and dines well almost every night, sleeps after luncheon, then to the House of Commons, then a good and long dinner, and doesn't resume work at the Admiralty till after 10 p.m. and goes on till 1 or 2 a.m. He's got into the habit of calling conferences and subordinates after 1 a.m., which naturally upsets some of the admirals who are men of sound habits. So there is a general atmosphere of strain at the Admiralty, which is all wrong, yet Winston is such a popular hero and so much the war leader that he cannot be dropped, but he ought somehow to be rested." Now, that was the 4th of May, 1940. 6 days later, of course, he's Prime Minister. And on the eve of that appointment, Sir Alexander Cadogan, senior civil servant at the Foreign Office, doubted in his diary that we would get a better PM than Neville. And I think we forget too easily that Churchill wasn't elected Prime Minister in May 1940. He was there because the Labour Party would no longer serve under Neville Chamberlain in a national coalition, and because Lord Halifax, the Conservative Foreign Secretary, was not willing to try and lead a wartime government from the House of Lords rather than the Commons. It was a Westminster coup from which Churchill emerged as the only leading Conservative with the popular credibility and the political ability to form a government. And in spite of Churchill's feelings of destiny, that doesn't mean that he inherited a strong position. Quite the contrary. To form his national coalition, he had to offer places in his war cabinet to the Labour leaders, Clement Attlee and Arthur Greenwood. To keep his own Conservative Party on side, he had to give 2 remaining seats to Chamberlain, his predecessor, and Halifax, his main rival. So as he looked around that famous cabinet table, he was confronted not by political allies. He may have had public support, but he didn't have a political power base in Westminster. So how did he respond to this? Well, Churchill strengthened his position immediately by making himself not just Prime Minister, but also Minister of Defence. And this was a new innovation. What that meant was that the chiefs of staff, the military commanders, were now reporting directly to him. He downgraded the role of the service ministers, the First Lord of the Admiralty, the Secretary of State for War, the Secretary of State for Air, removing them from his war cabinet. And he made it clear that he was going to play a direct role in managing operations. In other words, he wasn't going to play the chairman's role of sitting above the fray and delegating. He was going to be a chief executive. The key change with Churchill coming in as Prime Minister was that he was now at the centre. He was no longer one oversized wheel putting a stress on the system from the outside. He was now the engine driving the whole vehicle. And this meant that the whole system can now be designed and adapted around him. making it better able to accommodate his rather eccentric work habits, helping him to maximise his productivity and containing his excesses, while providing a solid administrative framework for his decision-making. I mean, effectively what he does is to weld the Downing Street machine and the private secretaries to the War Cabinet Secretariat to his own group of advisers and form one single inner circle. The change in tone was, of course, summed up by the little red stickers reading "Action this day," which he would attach to key minutes and telegrams. But, of course, this system was immediately tested by military crisis. Churchill became Prime Minister on the 10th of May, 1940, the very day that Hitler launched his Blitzkrieg offensive against France and the Low Countries. And neither the new Prime Minister nor any of his inner circle could have anticipated how quickly the military situation would deteriorate. Their whole military strategy had been predicated on the fact that the French army, assisted by the much smaller British Expeditionary Force, and supported by the Royal Navy and the Air Force, would be able to hold the Germans in Belgium and northern France. When German armour, supported by dive bombers, came crashing through the Ardennes forest, simply bypassing the defences of the Maginot Line, the whole plan unravelled, opening up a huge gap in the Allied flank, so that within days the situation was desperate. Churchill was still constructing his cabinet. He'd had no time at all to bed in. Now he was faced with a hugely difficult dilemma. On the one hand, he wanted to fight, and he had stated publicly that his policy was to wage war until victory. He also clearly felt a duty to support his ally, France. On the other, he realised that every man killed, boat sunk, or more crucially, fighter plane shot down, was not going to be available for the defence of Britain. So in the second chapter of my book, I look at how he navigated at this crisis. And one of my conclusions is that he did so much more consultatively than he's often given credit for. Because against this bleak backdrop, it was inevitable that French requests for further British support should intensify. Prime Minister Reynaud visited London on Sunday the 26th of May and painted a grim picture of the French inability to carry on by land, sea or air, before proposing that the Allies ask Mussolini for terms that would ensure Italy's non-belligerency, the idea being that that would then free up French troops to come north. Churchill reported on this conversation to his war cabinet on the 26th of May at 2 p.m, causing Alexander Cadogan to note in his diary, "Reynaud doesn't say that France will capitulate, but all his conversation goes to show that he sees no alternative." And it's no coincidence that Lord Halifax chose that moment to raise the question in the War Cabinet of whether Britain should use the French initiative to investigate possible peace terms with Germany through Italy. A discussion which then continued in subsequent War Cabinets for 3 days. Now, those debates, of course, have been the subject of a book by John Lukács, of a play, and they're at the heart of the new movie featuring Gary Oldman. They occurred at a most vulnerable moment, and they threatened to derail Churchill's whole policy of waging war. Here, then, was a very real and very early test of his leadership. He's only been Prime Minister for a few days, but he's now fighting on several interrelated fronts, on the political and military fronts. Churchill's response to this crisis, I think, shows him exploiting to the full his power to convene the meetings and control the agendas. Because what he does, in effect, over the course of the next 3 days, is to hold 2 parallel series of War Cabinet meetings. He restricts the discussions about an approach to Mussolini to a very small group, the 5 members of the War Cabinet, supplemented from the 27th of May by Alexander Cadogan and Archibald Sinclair, the latter in his capacity as leader of the Liberal Party and therefore a coalition partner. And it's this small group that holds 3 separate meetings to thrash out the issue. I'm afraid, for those of you who've seen Darkest Hour, the meetings don't take place underground in the Cabinet War Rooms. Why would they? The bombing hadn't started yet. They actually take place in Admiralty House, in the Prime Minister's room at the House of Commons and at Downing Street. And these are the individuals on whom that momentous decision rests. Chamberlain, Churchill's predecessor, still leader of the Conservative Party. Lord Halifax, the powerful Foreign Secretary, Churchill's main rival for the premiership. Attlee and Greenwood, the leader and deputy leader of the Labour Party. Archibald Sinclair, the leader of the Liberal Party and Secretary of State for Air, and Alexander Cadogan, the only civil servant present. And with the sole exception of Sinclair, who'd served with Churchill in the trenches in World War I and thereafter as his personal military secretary, this was not a group of natural allies for Churchill. It was a war cabinet forced upon him by expediency, as I said earlier. And just think of the constant pressure. These men are in almost constant session, suffering the claustrophobia of sitting almost constantly in smoke-filled rooms, interrupted only by the latest bleak news from the front. But by managing the meetings, by separating the political and military agendas, Churchill allows the politicians to focus on the key political issue, and he contains the damage that might have been caused had discussions about possible peace terms taken place within a larger body. The records of those tense, smaller meetings show a less black and white debate than is portrayed in the movie Darkest Hour. Halifax wanted to explore the possibility of mediation in order to avoid bloodshed, but even he was only prepared to go so far in ceding British independence. Churchill feared that any exploration of terms was a slippery slope and that Britain was likely to get a better deal after she had demonstrated her resolve and capacity to fight. But, faced with the dire military situation and the fact that they felt at that point that they might not be able to get more than 50,000 off the beaches of Dunkirk, he had to be careful to take his colleagues with him. So he allows the issues to be talked out at great length, sometimes acrimoniously. And it's the support of Attlee, Greenwood, Sinclair, and ultimately Chamberlain for Churchill's position that proves vital in countering Halifax's proposal. Also important was the information that the Prime Minister was waiting for from his chiefs of staff, a key report confirming that Britain would be able to fight on with a reduced army, and that the Navy and Air Force could defend the islands as long as aircraft production and civilian morale could be maintained, and ultimately as long as we got American support. Churchill's final ploy on the afternoon of the 28th of May was to break the smaller war cabinet discussion halfway through and to call the first meeting of all the ministers outside the war cabinet. He didn't have to take the tube because the two meetings actually took place in his parliamentary office. And to my mind, the Darkest Hour movie makes a mistake in suggesting that he needed his resolve stiffening by others at this key moment. I think that does him a disservice. He was always going to fight if he could. What he's been waiting for is to know that he can. Instead, seizing the moment, he addresses the wider group with a stirring extempore speech in which he outlines the serious nature of the crisis, but then pledges to go down choking in his own blood rather than countenance surrender. It's a bravura performance which wins an ovation from a hardened and usually cynical political audience. But more crucially, it wins their support for his policy of continuing to wage war. Leo Amery, the Secretary of State for India, a near contemporary of Churchill's and a not uncritical friend, was there, and he records in his diary that it left all of us tremendously heartened by Winston's resolution and grip of things. He is a real war leader and one whom it is worthwhile serving under. And when the war cabinet meeting resumed at 7 p.m, immediately after Churchill's speech, it was clear that he'd effectively won the argument against any exploration of negotiations. But I would argue that the timing of his intervention had been critical, that he played his hand well, that he'd kept his cabinet together, and that he'd prepared his government for the collapse of their ally. Yet, with the Battle of Britain and the Blitz about to be unleashed, he cannot have seen it at the time as a turning point. At the time, he was simply trying to find a way to keep fighting. It's British weakness in the aftermath of the fall of France that influences Churchill's war strategy going forward. Churchill had promised victory, but how is he going to deliver it? From September, London is being hammered by the Blitz. From the 7th of September, it is bombed for 76 nights consecutively, excepting only the 2nd of November. No one knew whether a modern city could survive such a sustained and heavy bombardment from the air. Both Churchill and his Chief of Staff, Ismay, describe a visit to a London bomb site by the Prime Minister, though interestingly they put it in slightly different locations. And when Churchill's car arrives at the scene, he doesn't know how he's going to be received. It must have been a moment of some tension. The arrival of the Prime Minister's car quickly attracts a crowd. He can't have been sure how they were going to react. Would their grief and anger be directed against him and the establishment for leading them into such peril and for failing to provide better protection? Instead, according to Ismay, good old Winnie, they cried. We thought you'd come and see us. We can take it. Give it 'em back. Now, in Churchill's account, he notes how, as he departed, a harsher mood swept over this haggard crowd. Give it 'em back, they cried, and let them have it too. I undertook forthwith to see that their wishes were carried out, and this promise was certainly kept. Alas for poor humanity. Now, no doubt Churchill told this story in his memoirs because it chimed with his own attacking instincts. In a way, this is the real underground moment. But it's one thing to commit yourself to waging war. It's another thing to actually deliver a British offensive in 1940. Churchill's options are severely limited. How is he going to give it them back? How do you take the fight to the enemy? Britain can't fight in France anymore, other than small commando operations or special operation executive raids, both of which, of course, he encourages. We can bomb Germany. Churchill starts authorising bombing raids from the moment he is in Downing Street. But Britain lacks the strength, and it's clearly going to take time to build up bomber forces, while the Germans and the Luftwaffe can hit us far more easily and effectively. I argue in the book that one theatre where he can take the fight to the enemy, where he does have an army and a fleet, is in the Mediterranean, especially once the Italians are in the war from June. Churchill is a lifelong imperialist, and he's not ready to cede the British position in Malta and Egypt and Palestine. He also knows the Mediterranean theatre well, and I think he chooses it deliberately as a viable battleground. It's a logical decision, but it carries huge implications, because once you commit to fighting in the Mediterranean, it's going to be difficult to get out, especially once the Germans move down, as they inevitably do, into Yugoslavia and Greece. If you divert resources to the Mediterranean, you're going to be doing it at the expense of other theatres. General Dill, as chief of the Imperial General Staff, argued in 1941 for the defence of Singapore, reminding Churchill that it had always been the priority for British policy to guarantee the defence of Australia and New Zealand, something that Churchill himself had signed up to in the past. But the Prime Minister now argued that we had to fight the actual war in front of us, not the hypothetical battle that might not come. And besides, he argued, if the Japanese did try and attack the British in the Far East, they would have to go through the American Pacific Fleet, which therefore ultimately guaranteed British security. Unfortunately, as you all know, with the benefit of hindsight, the Japanese came to the same conclusion and provided their own answer. In my book, I look at the question of fighting with allies, because, of course, Churchill was desperate for allies, and how Churchill came to co-create the Atlantic Charter in an attempt to move the Americans closer to war, only then to suddenly and unexpectedly find himself in alliance with the Soviet Union when Hitler invaded Germany. It's a period and a dilemma that is perhaps summed up best by two quotations, both recorded by Jock Colville in his diary, which we have in the Archive Centre. On his courtship of President Roosevelt, Churchill proudly admitted to Colville, "No lover ever studied every whim of his mistress as I did those of President Roosevelt." While in his justification for his support for the Soviet Union after the German invasion, of course, Churchill had been an arch anti-communist since the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, but in his justification for his support for the Soviet Union, he remarked that if Hitler had invaded hell, I would at least make a favourable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. But the important point, I think, is that he had no choice, because of his comparatively weak position, to almost simultaneously embrace the principles of both the 1941 Atlantic Charter and the realpolitik of the 1942 Anglo-Soviet Treaty, even though it was clear that those two things are going to pull in opposite directions. He didn't know, of course, how long the Russians would hold, and he didn't know how long the Americans would wait before coming into the conflict. He'd embraced the devil and crossed the deep blue sea. He'd shown himself willing to travel politically and ideologically in order to start constructing this grand alliance, but there was also very little doubt that his own personal preferences and priorities lay in the West with the United States. But it's clear that the American and Soviet attitudes to the post-war settlement, and especially to the fate of the Balkan and East European countries that bordered on Russia, were going to be very different. Now, in 1941, these problems were hypothetical, and subordinated to the need to obtain military victory. But as the war progresses, Churchill would inevitably find himself caught between the contrasting attitudes and positions of his two allies. Did the defeated nations have the right to determine their own form of government? Should Poland be forced to cede territory to the Soviet Union against her will? How might a policy of assigning spheres of influence in Balkan countries be reconciled with the clauses of the Atlantic Charter opposing territorial aggrandizement and interference? Churchill was clearly aware of the challenges, but in the short term, he knew he needed both the United States and Russia. His heart yearned to bring the Americans into the conflict. His head knew that he had to keep the Soviets there. Now, we focus so much on 1940 nowadays that we tend to forget how long the war was and how bleak some of the middle periods were. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 had the power to do Churchill real harm. It coincided with a renewed offensive by Rommel in the North African desert. And then on the 12th of February, the powerful German battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, along with the cruiser Prince Eugene, slip undetected from their moorings at Brest and make their way brazenly up the channel to safety in Germany without being sunk, having only been belatedly detected and attacked by the Royal Navy and the RAF. So it looked in February 1942 as though Britain was being outsmarted and outmanoeuvred in every theatre. Public opinion in the UK is outraged. Alexander Cadogan records in his diary that this is the blackest time yet of the war. And Churchill later conceded that it was certainly not strange that public confidence in the administration and its conduct of the war should have quavered. You can see something of Churchill's own gut reaction to the fall of Singapore in this telegram here, which survives in his papers. So this is the 10th of February 1942. It's to General Wavell, the theatre commander, and he says, "The battle must be fought to the bitter end at all costs. The 18th Division has a chance to make its name in history. Commanders and senior officers should die with their troops. The honour of the British Empire and of the British Army is at stake. I rely on you to show no mercy to weakness in any form." You can see how desperate he is to hold Singapore. And of course, just a few days later, Percival's force there capitulates, the largest capitulation in British military history. And interestingly, although Churchill will periodically fire off these sorts of emails, telegrams, he very, very rarely follows up on them. And of course, the reason he's so desperate is that he knows that he's now vulnerable. And indeed, he now finds himself criticised on all sides. To the Prime Minister of Australia, John Curtin, the loss of Singapore was always going to be an inexcusable betrayal. And viewed from Australia and New Zealand, Britain should clearly have done more to secure Singapore's defence. Yet as the War Cabinet noted on the 16th of February, just after Singapore had fallen, in retrospect, it now seemed a pity that we'd sent the 18th Division. Churchill was simultaneously vulnerable to the charges of not having done enough to reinforce Singapore and of only having sent reinforcements when it was too late for them to be effective. The same was clearly true of his decision to send the battleship Prince of Wales, which was sunk by Japanese air attack along with HMS Repulse on the 10th of December. Not only had the Prime Minister insisted on the ship's dispatch, but he'd also chosen to publicise the fact as a deterrent to Japan and a reassurance to Australia and New Zealand. General Brooke, Alan Brooke, a not always uncritical observer of Churchill, noted in his diary for the 16th of February, the day after the fall of Singapore, that the Prime Minister was on the whole in a very good mood, and later added this was typical of Winston. In a real crisis, he was always at his best and stood all the heavy shocks without flinching. My book looks at how he manages the crisis, and I think he does it by facing down growing opposition in Parliament, by allowing debate, and by calling a confidence vote in his administration, but also by cleverly restructuring his war cabinet. He brings in the socialist politician Stafford Cripps, the former ambassador to the Soviet Union, whose growing popularity threatened to undermine Churchill. And by making Cripps leader of the House and responsible for managing government business, he ties him into his own administration. He bows to pressure to create a new Ministry of Production, but he deftly avoids all attempts and calls to strip him of his role as Minister of Defence. And I think time and again, when you look in detail at key moments like this during the war, you see how tactical and political Churchill could be. But of course, all of that meant nothing if we didn't have victories in the field. And up to the summer of 1942, Britain had been defeated in Norway, in France, in Greece, and now in the Far East. Churchill sacked General Auchinleck from the Middle East Command because he believed that the Eighth Army had become demoralised. He also did it because he needed at that moment to send a strong signal to both the Americans and the Russians that Britain could and would fight in the Mediterranean. Roosevelt and Stalin are both pushing for a second front in France. Churchill needed to finish what had been started in the Mediterranean and was rightly sceptical about doing something too early or too small scale in Northern Europe. A theme running throughout my book is exactly that Churchill's key decisions have to be seen as products of the specific time, place, and context in which they were made. Thus, the policy of unconditional surrender must be seen in the context of the Casablanca Conference that coined it in January 1943. The insistence on the complete surrender of Germany, Italy, and Japan, even if their regimes changed, has been criticised by some for potentially prolonging the war by undermining internal resistance within those countries to their fascist regimes. But in early 1943, in the absence of a second front in France, Churchill and Roosevelt needed to send a strong signal to Stalin, who didn't attend the meeting in Morocco, that they wouldn't seek a separate peace with Hitler. With only limited gains in North Africa and no easy end to the war yet in sight, they also wanted a message that would bolster domestic morale while simultaneously sending a clear response to the horrific information that was now emerging about Nazi atrocities against the Jews. What comes through the contemporary accounts is that Churchill was never happier than in the midst of a crisis. Conversely, what he hated was periods of inactivity. And you can see this most clearly in the months running up to D-Day. The diaries of Brooke and Cadogan for the first half of 1944 record their personal frustrations with the Prime Minister, and they do so in terms that often reflect on his declining physical and mental health. So Brooke speculates that the Prime Minister might not last 3 months, that he's failing fast, was dull, lifeless, and missing the main points, and that at other times it seemed as if Churchill had lost all balance, so that Brooke felt as though he were chained to the chariot of a lunatic. But Churchill didn't take to his bed and have a nervous breakdown, as one recent movie would have you believe. His response, interestingly, of course, was to seek the stimulus of action. He actually makes an appeal to be allowed to go and accompany the troops on D-Day and actually cross over to the beaches on D-Day itself. Admiral Ramsay draws up a plan that would have seen the Prime Minister depart on HMS Belfast on D-1, transfer to a destroyer, and, if possible, make a short tour of the beaches. Ramsay does this because Churchill orders him to do it. But, of course, the last thing that Ramsay or Eisenhower or any of the military commanders want is Churchill anywhere near the action. Of course, only one person can order Churchill not to go, and that's the King. Churchill knows that, so he uses a royal audience to say to King George VI, well, wouldn't it be good, as if in days of old the King and his First Minister went over together. And the King is initially swept away with this, and it falls on Alan Lascelles, the King's private secretary, to tell the King, there's absolutely no way you can go, that's a huge constitutional crisis. Not only that, but the Prime Minister can't go either, and you're going to have to tell him. Even then, it takes 2 handwritten letters from the King. The second one sent on the 2nd of June 1944, before Churchill grudgingly concedes and doesn't go. My final chapter of my book looks at why Churchill fought the 1945 election at all, and having decided to do so, against the advice of his wife Clementine, why he chose to fight it so badly. Now, exhaustion clearly played a part, but it's not the whole answer. I argue that he lost partly because he was a fighter and couldn't stop fighting. The very thing that made him such an effective war leader on the international front caused him to completely misjudge the public mood on the home front. Here he should have played the chairman's role. He should have stayed above the political fray and presented himself as the national saviour and the candidate of unity, which is exactly what the Conservative Party expected him to do. Instead, he said he was not ready to be put on a pedestal and threw himself into vicious political attacks against the Labour Party. In part, this was a return to his political roots. Churchill, of course, had been a passionate opponent of socialism throughout his political career. Even in his most radical phase as a young liberal in 1908, he'd castigated it as a barren philosophy that sought to pull down wealth, destroy private interests, kill enterprise. But I think It was a conviction that must have been strengthened by his current view of the international scene, where he saw communist forces seeking to install themselves in Albania, Greece, Italy, Poland and Yugoslavia, and where he feared a consequent loss of democratic freedoms. The rhetoric and language that he'd used to condemn the aspirations and actions of the communists in Greece was still fresh in his mind and on his tongue. Churchill was also finally free from the constraints of a national coalition and able to respond to some of his most vociferous critics on the left, people like Anurin Bevan and Harold Lasky, whom he'd felt had been undermining his foreign policy and his premiership. It may have been a big leap to argue, as he tried to do, that the British Parliamentary Labour Party would lead inexorably to Soviet-style communism, but Churchill, I think, in the 1945 election was seeking to present two alternative visions for the future of Britain. And that went to the heart of why he'd become Prime Minister and why he had waged war for 5 long years. In his speech to the Conservative Party conference in March 1945, he acknowledged the need for state regulation and control in wartime as a means to a specific end. But once that end was reached, control for control's sake is senseless. He'd been fighting to preserve British independence and the empire, and also British liberties. Rather than break with the past, he was looking for continuity. Thus, in his final election broadcast, he looks back to the Britain of September 1939, arguing that it was already peopled by a far stronger, healthier, better bred, better led, better housed, and better educated race than had been the case before the First World War. Britain did not need a brave new world. She needed to be able to return and pick up where she had been forced to leave off. When Lord Moran, his doctor, told him that there were two opposing ideas in the country and that universal gratitude to him was tempered by the notion that he was not keen on this brave new world business, Churchill replied, "The desire for a new world is nothing like universal. The gratitude is." He was wrong. Ultimately, Churchill fought and lost the campaign on the principles he believed in, using the only methods he knew. He didn't have the patience, time, or the energy to adapt his tactics. He fought aggressively because he was a fighter. He kept going because he was not ready to become an icon, believed in his own abilities to do the job, and disliked the alternatives. His conviction and self-belief blinkered him to the changed political reality. By 1945, Anthony Eden had spent 5 years working alongside Winston Churchill, and of the election campaign and Churchill's failure to see beyond the cheers of the crowd, he wrote, "He could not be expected to sense that there was also something valedictory in their message. He would not have been Winston Churchill if he had." Faced with a multitude of challenges, Churchill could not always make the right decisions, because, of course, in many cases there were no right decisions. Only different outcomes, all potentially difficult and damaging. He was often playing a weak hand with few resources. His preferred response was to live in the moment, to prioritise, debate, and then act upon the evidence in front of him. Many of those who worked most closely with him spoke about his ability to find and focus on what was most important. And Moran recalled Clementine telling him that Winston always saw things in blinkers. His eyes are focused on the point he's determined to attain. He sees nothing outside that beam. Churchill gambled that one success would lead to another. This was about seizing the moment. The key to victory was about moving forward. One battle at a time. That's how Winston waged war. Nor did he pretend it was otherwise. Speaking to the Commons on the 27th of February 1945, in the aftermath of the Yalta Conference, he reflected on his role. In 1940 to 41, when we in this island were all alone and invasion was so near, the actual steps we ought to take seemed plain and simple. If a man is coming across the sea to kill you, you do everything in your power to make sure that he dies before he finishes his journey. That may be difficult and painful, but it is at least simple. Now we enter into a world of imponderables, and at every stage occasions for self-questioning arise. It is a mistake to look too far ahead. Only one link in the chain of destiny can be handled at a time. To my mind, it was by keeping his eyes fixed on strengthening the individual links that Churchill helped to forge the chain, which ultimately led to victory and delivered on his promise. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.